Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into the hush of Victorian libraries, where whispers float like dust motes, gas lamps flicker beside stacks of old folios, and somewhere behind a reference desk, a librarian is scribbling the phrase mildly disruptive ghost into an index card. You're wrapped in a wool shawl, warm from the shoulders down but oddly chilled at the base of your neck. The floorboards creak like careful ghosts themselves. This isn't your usual haunted mansion setup. No chains, no wailing. This is a ghost story with paperwork. And you probably wouldn't survive a single shift in here, if we're being honest. Not with the filing system, not with the drafty corridors, and certainly not with whatever keeps rearranging the ethereal entities section when no one's looking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the stone steps of a minor lending library in suburban Surrey, circa 1875, give or take a few ledger entries. The fog's thick enough to nibble on, and the brass door handle is inexplicably warm. Inside, the air smells of tea leaves, mildew, and old ink, what most 19th century readers would simply call home. You're not here for a novel. You've come to witness the slow birth of one of the strangest cataloging traditions in history, the Victorian librarians' effort to document ghost sightings in painstaking, alphabetical detail. This wasn't a formal project, at first. It began as marginalia. A clerk at the Bodleian noted a peculiar rustling near the theology shelves. A student at Cambridge reported spectral tapping behind the dictionaries. And someone at the British Library, no name, naturally, left behind a carefully folded note that simply read, "Do not reshelve the green-bound folios after dark. Something watches." As more sightings crept in, a pattern emerged. Libraries weren't just places of knowledge, they were apparently ghost magnets. Why? Historians still argue whether it was the sheer volume of human thoughts stored under one roof, or just the number of people nodding off over a copy of Principles of Latin Grammar. By 1870, a few quietly curious librarians, always anonymous, always meticulous, began copying down these anecdotes. They used whatever was handy: blank checkout cards, slips of blotting paper, old train schedules. Some entries were no more than a sentence: woman in bonnet seen in mirror, second floor reading room, vanished upon eye contact. Others ran on for paragraphs, including full floor plans and seating charts. One clerk, whom we'll call Mr. A, since that's all he signed, began sorting these into a binder. He labeled it miscellaneous, nocturnal disturbances. Then he made tabs: W for wraiths, P for poltergeists, B for benign presences, mostly old ladies in lace who tutted near overdue borrowers. This was the moment ghost stories entered the filing system. A small but passionate group followed Mr. A's lead. They didn't call themselves ghost hunters. That would be gauche. No, they were recorders of anomalous occurrences in reading facilities. Which is a deeply boring name, perfectly on brand for a project rooted in filing cabinets. Now imagine this: it's well past midnight. You're dozing under the soft glow of a library lamp shaped like a flower. Somewhere in the stacks, a page turns, though you're alone. You shift. The scent of lavender and coal smoke drifts past. And from the card catalog, a drawer quietly slides open. Inside, a yellowed card reads, "Spectre with monocle. History, British Colonial. Insists books be shelved by continent." Was it a prank? A shared hallucination? A slow rebellion by underpaid clerks in need of excitement? Possibly all three. But the reports kept growing. Some were funny. "Floating hat, no head," corrected my Latin declension aloud. Others were eerie. "Saw myself reading at desk. Realme was on break." And then there's the oddest part. They started cross-referencing. One ledger shows a column labeled repeat appearances. Another, temperature shifts by location. A marginal note reads, "Figure in tweed has not returned since rearrangement of political economy shelf." Possible connection? One entry suggests that certain hauntings were soothed by correct alphabetization. A haunted archive in Leeds reportedly went silent after they fixed a misfiled copy of Spectres and Spiritual Manifestations, Volume 2. Quirky detail? At least 3 libraries independently reported a spectral librarian. All female. All described as stern but fair. One was seen adjusting a boy's collar in 1883 before vanishing through a window, neatly closed moments later. You take a seat now, behind an old desk covered in inkpots and biscuit crumbs. In the drawer, another ghost card. This one reads, Flickering candle flame responded to questions with yes/no, accuracy 60%. Possessed light source? This is your introduction to a world of quiet ghost hunting that doesn't involve screaming or sage or cameras, just index cards, pipe smoke, and the gentle shuffling of a truly haunted bureaucracy. You lean back in your chair, the wood groaning softly beneath you, and take in the hush of the library's long-forgotten records room. It smells of beeswax, wool, and knowledge that has aged slowly, like a well-mannered cheese. A spiral-bound inventory book lies open on the desk, its entries so meticulously inked they could be mistaken for spells. And in a way, they are. By the 1880s, the practice of cataloging ghost sightings in libraries had spread quietly, like a rumor that preferred footnotes. Most institutions denied it formally, of course. But informal practices are where the real magic tends to live. Some clerks created dedicated paranormal occurrences logs. These were handwritten in the margins of real catalog books, nestled discreetly between entries for agricultural treatises and shipping registers. Others clipped newspaper ghost reports and tucked them between the pages of the quarterly journal of boring yet unassailable facts. Librarians in Edinburgh, it said, favored ledger columns organized by ghost mood, melancholy, impatient, and obscenely punctual. The system was never standardized, and perhaps that's what gave it charm. One library used a red wax seal to mark confirmed hauntings. Another placed a single dry lavender bud between the report and its corresponding shelf. You wonder how many readers noticed, or cared, that there were small rituals occurring right under their noses, shelved next to sermons and sea charts. At the Norwich Public Reading Room, a young assistant named Miss Bethany Pratt went so far as to color-code her records using hand-mixed watercolor inks, blue for chill-inducing apparitions, green for sound-only disturbances, and violet for ambiguous presences, a term she refused to explain. She once submitted a 30-page report titled Polite Ghosts and Their Relationship to Classical Music Preferences. It was politely returned with a note, "This is all quite mad. Please file under miscellanea." Historians still argue whether these librarians truly believed in what they were documenting. Some suggest the reports were elaborate jokes, inside references among underpaid staff. Others insist the Victorian obsession with classification made even spectral phenomena seem worthy of indexing. After all, this was an age in love with systems, taxonomy, train timetables, moral hierarchies, and dessert forks. You leaf through another stack of notes, faded now, with the crispness of old linen. One entry, dated October 1886, reads, "Spectral hand reached from between 2 copies of Robinson Crusoe. No noise. Retracted quickly. Smelled faintly of tobacco." Another, voices heard arguing about decimal placement in philosophy of numbers. Origin unknown. No one present but self and 2 marmalade sandwiches. Some of the most fascinating sightings occurred during cataloging marathons, those long, tedious sessions where clerks updated listings by candlelight, often skipping supper in favor of alphabetical precision. A report from Manchester mentions a stack of books that refused to stay alphabetized, repeatedly rearranging themselves by color. The culprit? Invisible agent with a poor grasp of Dewey Decimal. By now you're half convinced the ghosts weren't haunting the libraries so much as participating in them. They had opinions. They made edits. They knocked over ink bottles, sure, but they also seemed to disapprove of genre mixing. One ledger mentions a haunting that ceased only after the Gothic novels were moved away from Methodist sermons. That's not to say these librarians weren't frightened. Some refused to work alone at night. One man in York insisted on whistling while shelving to ward off the corridor thing. Miss Pratt, ever dutiful, carried a small pewter bell which she rang 3 times before entering the archives. If nothing answers, she wrote in her journal, one may proceed with caution. It wasn't just books that reacted strangely. Paperweights went missing. Pens bled ink in shapes that looked suspiciously like Latin. A moth once flew out of a folio and vanished midair, leaving behind the scent of lemon and lavender. Ghosts? Mischief? Library air currents? Scholars continue to debate. You step into the card catalog room now. It's lined wall to wall with wooden drawers, each bearing a brass label etched in faint serif script. You pull one open and thumb through entries, normal at first, then not. Subject: Hauntings, regional. Keyword: whispering near Welsh poetry. Another: entity seen through magnifying glass only, might be Librarians' aunt. What's surprising is not that librarians recorded these things. It's that they did so with such methodical calm. There's no panic in the prose. No melodrama. Just quietly phrased observations, signed with initials and time stamped down to the quarter hour. One account, oddly touching, describes a ghost who sat nightly in the theology section, always choosing the same chair. When that chair was removed during renovations, the sightings stopped. Staff later found an old photograph of a retired librarian. Same chair, same spot, same gentle frown. And then there are the fringe entries. A particularly spirited clerk from Bath recorded a full conversation with an entity who only communicated via book selection. The clerk would ask a question aloud, then wait for a book to fall off the shelf. He claimed to have discussed everything from grammar reform to whether toast ought to be buttered before slicing. You laugh softly now, imagining a ghost so committed to debate that it lingers centuries just to win an argument over punctuation. It's easy to forget, as you sit amid the flickering shadows and the rustle of old pages, that these librarians weren't just scholars, they were witnesses. They catalogued not just books, but moments of the inexplicable. They didn't scream. They didn't flee. They made a new folder. You move slowly through the next corridor, where the air is thick with that warm, papery musk libraries accumulate over decades. It smells like musty leather bindings, ghostly starch, and whatever memory dust is made of. A wall of thick, glass-fronted cabinets stares back at you. Behind each pane rests a rare volume, propped at an angle like a relic too sacred for mortal hands. Here, ghost sightings were taken even more seriously, because these were the valuable books, the ones you weren't supposed to touch without gloves, a chaperone, and a nervous breakdown. And yet, here too, things happened. One peculiar case from 1891 tells of a first edition Newton being found mysteriously open to a chapter on action at a distance, a favorite haunt for ghost enthusiasts who love a little cosmic poetry with their physics. The glass wasn't broken. No one had keys. And the librarian on duty swore he heard soft humming, like an elderly choir rehearsing off-key. It wasn't the only time music made an appearance. A recurring phenomenon in Bristol's rare manuscripts room involved a phantom waltz. Always at dusk. Always faint. Witnesses described it as melancholy with a hint of smugness. A few suggested it might be leftover vibrations from a piano once housed in the reading room. Others insisted the library had developed a personality, and that it simply missed parties. Historians still argue whether the music was real, residual, or an auditory hallucination brought on by catalog fatigue and too much ink smell. But entries were made. Quietly. Dated. Filed. And moved on from, as all good bureaucracies must do. It's strange how often ghosts in libraries seem more curious than malevolent. They ruffle pages. They whisper. They show up on security logs in rooms that no longer exist. There's a calmness to their interference, like they're just checking in, making sure the books still matter. One entry from a small university archive mentions a cold finger that traced a line beneath a particular passage in a biography of Queen Mary. When the librarian looked up, the finger, and its presumed owner, were gone. The marked line? She was said to be both gentle and frightening. You imagine a ghost with a flair for the dramatic, choosing its moments like a stage actor, always aware of its audience. Or maybe it's not theatrical at all, just practical. You're there, it's there. Why not point out a good quote? The catalog system for these incidents, while wildly inconsistent, often reflects the personalities of those recording them. One card index from Bath features a section labeled Otherworldly Annotations, where notes were made in a special copperplate script reserved for strange happenings. Others opted for plain labels like Unexplained Interruption or filed under Spectral Interference. In the back of the London Antiquarian Society's library, a shelf bears a note, Haunted. Do not reshelve without permission. Below it, a discreet brass plaque reads, Caution, books shift themselves. And apparently they did. Staff noticed titles reordering by theme, as if the collection preferred being arranged by mood rather than author. The more you read, the more it feels like the ghosts weren't intruders in these spaces, they were custodians. Stewards of silence. Gentle nags for order. Quirky tidbit. One assistant in 1874 created a fictional ghost named Mr. Penfold to explain away every unusual occurrence. Spilled ink? Penfold. Missing catalog card? Penfold again. Eventually, the library adopted him as a sort of spectral mascot. A carved wooden nameplate was affixed to an empty desk in the staff room, reserved for Mr. Penfold. Strangely, nothing odd ever happened to that desk again. The line between joke and belief, prank and reverence, was always blurry. But the logs persisted. Even if nobody fully believed in the ghosts, nobody dared erase the entries either. Just in case. You turn a corner and enter a reading alcove flanked by curtained windows and high-backed chairs. The kind of place where professors disappear for hours, pretending to annotate something when really they're just hiding from students and enjoying the warmth of the radiator. A librarian once claimed to have seen a figure seated in the farthest chair, head bowed, one hand resting lightly on a closed book. When approached, the figure vanished, leaving behind a faint scent of violets and a pressed violet flower between the book's pages. Pressed flowers, you learn, were a surprisingly common calling card. Whether from memory, ritual, or habit, several libraries reported ghostly traces in the form of lavender sprigs, chamomile blossoms, or, most haunting of all, fully intact snowdrops, despite no recent snow. You wonder whether ghosts are flower arrangers now. Or perhaps the dead never truly abandoned their hobbies. Librarians responded with their own quiet codes. They left offerings, polished nameplates, whispered good mornings to empty rooms. The old-timers especially seemed to accept the hauntings not as burdens but as a kind of proof that the building, like the books within it, still had something to say. You glance down at the catalog binder in your lap. The entries blur slightly. Maybe from age. Maybe from a creeping drowsiness you didn't realize had taken hold. There's something comforting about this place. This room. This idea. Ghosts and libraries. Not clanking chains or blood-curdling howls. Just a page turned. A breath in the silence. A well-placed violet. You ease back in your seat, spine settling into the hollow curve of a velvet-cushioned reading chair that's seen more bottoms than a parliament bench. The room around you feels layered in time. Faded carpet patterns echo older, sharper ones beneath, and the wallpaper flowers seem to have opinions of their own. Even the dust motes float like they remember better centuries. Here in the upper stacks, you come across a curious cabinet labeled simply, Ephemeral Accounts. The drawer pulls are lion-shaped, chipped and dignified, and as you slide one open, the scent of camphor and long-dried ink rises like a memory trying to introduce itself. These are the personal logs, not official catalog entries, but handwritten notes from individual librarians. Jotted down in margins, tucked into envelopes, slipped between card files. The tone is casual, thoughtful, and sometimes just odd enough to make your eyebrows perform a cautious little dance. One entry reads, Shelf 19B, strong scent of tobacco this morning. No staff member smokes. Book on mesmerism damp at the edges, spine warm to the touch. Another, written in delicate script, sound of pages turning in empty east wing. Investigated. No wind. No intruder. Left biscuit as thanks. It was gone by morning. And there it is, that blend of sincere observation and gentle superstition that defines so much of these librarians' relationship with their surroundings. It's not fear, exactly. More like cautious respect. As if the library isn't just a building, but a collaborator. A quiet, opinionated coworker who's just as likely to shelve your umbrella as rearrange your filing system in alphabetical vengeance. Historians still argue whether these ephemera count as folklore, diary, or documentation. Some say the librarians were simply tired, overworked, and sleep-deprived, spinning stories to entertain themselves. Others suggest it was an early form of occupational mythology, a soft mythos built to cope with the endless stillness of archival labor. Quirky tidbit: one Victorian librarian reportedly kept a separate phantom log, not for the ghosts themselves but for objects that appeared to be haunted: inkpots that rattled slightly at dusk, chairs that refused to stay aligned, a book of Icelandic poetry that inexplicably felt cold. It had its own color-coded entries and was affectionately referred to as the temperamental inventory. The ghost entries rarely claimed violence. No reports of banshee wails or flying tomes. Just polite disturbances. A chair that rocks gently when no one's there. Books that refuse to stay shelved alphabetically. One librarian wrote, tried to place Sir Gawain and the Green Knight between Gilgamesh and Great Expectations. It moved itself back to mythology next day. Twice. There's something charmingly passive-aggressive about Victorian ghosts. As if the afterlife has a bureaucracy, and haunting is just another form of clerical work. You imagine one in wire-rimmed spectacles, muttering about decimal systems and the youth of today, invisible cardigan flapping in a phantom breeze. You turn another page and find a longer account, dated 1878, from a night clerk stationed in the Bodleian's basement archives. He describes a repeated incident where the temperature would dip sharply each time he catalogued books on the supernatural. His oil lamp would flicker, his tea would chill, and on one occasion, a chill ran through the ink on the page, leaving an elegant smear shaped almost like a question mark. He began bringing 2 coats and eventually left the post. The original note is attached to a scrap of catalogued parchment that reads, "Note: leave the occult shelf alone on Mondays." Not all entries are solemn. Some are borderline cheeky. One scribbled line in red ink, spectre or sleep deprivation? Either way, it needs to learn the Dewey Decimal. You begin to see these logs not just as records, but as a kind of folklore in motion. Stories pass through the margins, folded into the everyday, unacknowledged in official ledgers but alive in every whispered joke between librarians. You notice a pattern. The earliest notes are tentative, brief: cold breath felt near desk, or book appeared misfiled, staff unaccounted. But over time, they become more narrative, more detailed. As if librarians had grown comfortable with the idea that documenting hauntings wasn't just tolerated, it was tradition. One librarian went so far as to create a set of fictional library stamps, spectrally verified, returned by unknown hand, and midnight loan, see attached wraith. They were never used officially. But the stamp pad remains, dusty and faintly amused. You come across a letter, unfiled, written in looping penmanship on crisp linen stationery. It's addressed to whomever finds this after I'm gone. The author speaks of a shadow seen repeatedly on the 3rd-floor mezzanine, always facing away, always at the same hour. They call it the polite watcher. No menace, only presence. The letter ends with a note: he doesn't need exorcising. Just acknowledgement. A nod will do. And maybe that's the heart of it. These librarians didn't see their ghosts as something to fight or flee. They were part of the building's biography, characters in a story that continued, even if the original cast had long since clocked out. You let your eyes rest on the pages, their ink softly fading with age. The ghosts in these stories don't scream. They whisper. They linger. They turn pages when no one's looking and leave hints of lavender and tobacco in the air. They don't disrupt, they participate. You wonder briefly what entries future librarians will make. What strange noises or unexplained drafts they'll attribute to the past. Maybe even your presence here, now, reading and breathing and smiling softly at a particularly sarcastic footnote. You stretch gently. The chair creaks. You're still alone. Probably. But the silence feels friendly. Or at least, observed. The chair beneath you sighs as you shift your weight, a long wooden exhale, almost theatrical. You glance up. Still alone, or so it seems. But the air carries a hush with intent, like the library is waiting to hear what you'll do next. So naturally, you stay perfectly still and read on. As you follow the notes deeper into the ephemeral accounts drawer, you begin to notice how meticulously some librarians track patterns in their so-called hauntings. A favorite example. One entry meticulously charts the misfiling of ghost-related volumes over the course of 6 months. Spirits and specters ends up in medical history. Poltergeists and politesse is misfiled next to a book on etiquette. Coincidence? The note asks. Or suggestion? It appears some ghostly prankster has a literary sense of humor. Victorian librarians, like their spiritualist contemporaries, often leaned into the idea of correspondences, echoes, symmetries, faint rhymes between this world and the next. When you work with books every day, the logic of metaphor starts to leak into your real life. An unexplained cold breeze? Maybe it's just a draft. Or maybe it's the echo of some emotional punctuation mark left decades ago. Historians still argue whether these reports reflect actual belief or just occupational whimsy. Were these librarians true believers, or simply bored custodians of brittle paper who needed a little drama with their dust? You find a small ledger marked Librarians' Observations, After Hours. It's bound in faded blue buckram, the corners softened by time and gentle thumbings. The entries are brief, but consistent. Footsteps heard on mezzanine, no assigned staff. Oil lamp extinguished itself after reciting Psalm 91 aloud. Window latch found open despite prior securement. Wind direction did not favor. It reads less like a ghost story and more like fieldwork. One particularly diligent librarian included hand-drawn maps indicating the zones of frequent peculiarities. Oddly enough, most of them cluster around the poetry section, especially the romantic poets. Byron, Shelley, Keats. They're marked with little inky stars, each footnote questioning whether the shelves themselves might be sighing. A quirky detail. Someone attached a pressed flower next to an entry about a phantom scent. It's brittle, brown, possibly lavender. The note beside it reads, "Room perfumed itself without source. Search thoroughly." Flower appeared next morning. Uncatalogued. No explanation offered. Just a penciled smiley face. It's easy to imagine these librarians not as frightened by their ghosts, but charmed by them, like roommates you didn't choose, but gradually accepted. Some left offerings. One note describes placing sugar cubes on the sill near the theology section every St. Agnes Eve. For the girl who dreams, it says cryptically. You pull another card. It's a small note written in the margins of an index card for a biography of Edward Bulwer-Lytton. This book always ends up on the return desk. Patron unknown. Borrowed only at night. Stamped overdue 37 times. You glance at the card's date. It's from the 1890s. You're not sure whether the borrower ever existed, or still does. There's something deeply Victorian about this slow, bureaucratic haunting. No screams. No rattling chains. Just minor anomalies filed in triplicate. It's almost soothing. If you're going to be haunted, you think better by someone who respects the Dewey Decimal System. You find a clipped newspaper article folded into one of the files. The headline reads, "Phantom Librarian Strikes Again. Volume reappears weeks after removal." The body of the article is tongue-in-cheek, clearly meant for entertainment, but the detail is oddly precise. It quotes a library assistant swearing she saw a woman in crinoline glide past the shelves and vanish behind the law section. Smelled faintly of ink and sandalwood, she adds. The article is marked with a librarian's comment, utter nonsense. Also, quite accurate. She always smelled like that. The more you read, the more you see that these entries are less about the supernatural and more about the human impulse to document the unexplainable. To make space for the uncanny within the rigid walls of reason. These librarians weren't trying to prove anything. They were just noting what they noticed. A flicker here. A whisper there. Like footnotes to a larger, invisible manuscript. And perhaps most intriguing of all, there's a page labeled "Do Not File," placed almost deliberately out of order. It contains no narrative, just a list of names. Some with dates. some without. Each written in a different hand. No title. No context. Just a slow, neat column of remembered, or imagined, people. Was it a list of ghost witnesses? Former staff? Specters themselves? Historians have no consensus on this particular page. Some say it's a prank. Others a memorial. Still others believe it was a quiet attempt at exorcism, naming the unspoken in order to release it. You sit with that thought for a moment, the stillness of the upper stacks folding in around you like thick velvet curtains. A draft tugs at your sleeve, too gentle to be troubling. More like an exhale. Or a reminder. You've stumbled into a kind of secret history, written not in textbooks but in margin notes and catalog scribbles. These librarians were curators of more than just books. They were stewards of ambience, guardians of an unspoken etiquette between the living and whatever else happens to be browsing the aisles after dark. And they didn't try to solve the mystery. They just documented it. Like you're doing now. You flip the last card over. Blank. But warm to the touch. You set the warm card gently back in the drawer, not quite ready to question how cardboard could feel like it had a pulse. But then again, it's been a long night, and in this particular wing of the library, even the facts feel politely flexible. You stretch your legs, the floor creaking just enough to remind you that the building has its own memory, a long one, full of quiet footfalls and late-night candle smudges. You wander toward a new alcove. This section, labeled Disputed Accounts, is tucked beneath a creaky staircase and flanked by shelves so tall they nearly kiss the ceiling. The air smells like old beeswax and long-forgotten arguments. You reach for a folio bound in worn green cloth. The embossed lettering reads, Paranormal Correspondence, Librarians' Letters, 1842 to 1899. Inside is a collection of neatly copied letters, each penned by a librarian to another across the empire, sharing strange goings-on with the dry tone of someone reporting overdue books. One begins, Dearest Miss Eddings, we have once more misplaced specters of the Holy Roman Empire. It vanished from the lectern after Miss Plumstone's reading. Again. Another writes from Glasgow, have confirmed the phantom page-turner, no visible person, yet pages flick as though breathed upon rhythmically. Local clergy unbothered. Recommend salt. Salt comes up a lot, actually. Apparently, librarians believed a modest sprinkle beneath the reading chair deterred meddlesome spirits. One letter from Devon describes it as the housekeeping equivalent of locking the doors. Whether it worked or just encouraged the janitor to file complaints, historians still argue. You find a folded pamphlet tucked between pages, Regulations for Interspectral Interference. It's styled like any official guideline, stamped in red and written in the driest legalese imaginable. Lines include, should a disembodied entity vocalize past 10 p.m., record name if known and kindly redirect to philosophy. And, if spectral interference occurs during shelving hours, gently request reshelving assistance. The margin contains a scribble in faint pencil, did this actually happen? Another scribble answers, twice. Thursdays. You stifle a laugh and pull another letter. This one, more dramatic, have begun noting chill drafts on aisle 14, always when reading poetry aloud. Lady with veil observed twice in reflection, never in the room itself. She dislikes Coleridge. The implication, apparently, is that even ghosts have literary opinions. It's a soothing thought, actually. You imagine spending eternity just haunting your favorite corner, gently criticizing visitors' book choices and whispering poetry edits to passing readers. Some letters are more skeptical. One librarian in York writes, I've no faith in ghosts, but the inkpot certainly moved on its own. I blame ventilation. Or impish undergraduates. Another offers, we can explain most of it, bad ventilation, mold spores, heightened suggestibility, overexposure to Poe. A favorite phrase appears more than once, unexplained, but not unexpected. The phrase becomes a soft refrain as you leaf through page after page. Some entries have pressed leaves inside, remnants of a season long gone. One contains a petal from a ghost orchid. Another has a feather labeled simply, from the rafters, possibly pigeon, possibly not. There's even a brief exchange between two librarians regarding an old grandfather clock in the reading room. One writes, "It stopped at 3:07 3 nights running." The reply, "Perhaps wind it properly. If it persists, consider placing lavender nearby." The solution for nearly every problem, it seems, involved either herbs or a light scolding. You wonder if anyone ever felt genuinely afraid. Most of the entries suggest amusement more than terror, irritation more than alarm. These librarians were curators of order, and when the universe tugged a volume out of place, they responded not with panic, but polite paperwork. One particularly long letter details a haunting so subtle it might qualify as a design flaw. A librarian reports that a copy of The Anatomy of Melancholy repeatedly reappears on the reading table, regardless of where it's shelved. It always opens to the same page, a passage on nocturnal visitation and excessive brooding. The librarian's solution? A fresh label reading this book has needs. A quirky addition, there's an appendix of suggested phrases for logging spectral events. Books reshelved by invisible agency. Auditory anomaly, humming near the travelogues. Scent of clothes without source. Atmospheric density change in corner reading booth, no precipitation observed. You can almost hear the rustle of wool sleeves as a librarian in 1876 delicately lifts a candle, squints into the gloom, and writes something like "very drafty, possibly haunted." You read one final letter. It ends with, "There are more things in heaven and earth, dear Mabel, but here in the library, most of them prefer to whisper." You close the folio and set it back on the shelf with care. The quiet feels different now. Not empty, but full, like the room is breathing around you. You step out from beneath the staircase and glance upward. Nothing there. Just rafters and dust. But the floor creaks again. Not under you. Maybe it's just the building settling. Or maybe someone else wants to check out phantom visitors and the reading habit. Either way, you decide not to linger. You head for the next alcove, your footsteps gentle, your breath slow. The lamp overhead flickers, but only once. The corridor opens into a wider reading room, vaulted ceiling, long oak tables, and a cathedral hush broken only by the occasional rattle of a catalog drawer or the faint shush of a page being turned with unnecessary reverence. You pause beneath the central chandelier, which sways just a little too gently for there to be no draft. You don't check for one. This section is labeled Ethnographic Phenomena, a global index of visitations. The lettering is older, carved into a wooden lintel with enough solemnity to suggest someone, at some point, took this all very seriously. The first folio you open is a landscape register, oversized and oddly heavy, with reinforced spine bindings as if it contains something with weight beyond ink. Inside, you find meticulously copied accounts from libraries abroad, India, Egypt, Brazil, China, sent to British librarians for comparative purposes. Apparently, the ghosts weren't just local. They were global, and just as poorly behaved overseas. An entry from Bombay recounts a recurring disturbance in the Serampore College Library, books on death rituals found rearranged each morning to form a perfect spiral. Staff assumed a prank, until it happened while the room was locked. The spiral shape, one librarian noted, resembled a Jain mandala. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual resonance, or just a particularly dedicated philosophy student. A letter from Alexandria reports faint voices heard chanting in Coptic between the theology shelves. An included diagram suggests that the sound resonated most clearly near a particular volume, a copy of the Desert Fathers, bound in goatskin and missing 3 pages. The local librarian concludes, may be ambient, or divine, or both. Another page features a drawing, a delicate ink sketch of a robed figure with no face, seated cross-legged in the corner of a reading room in Kyoto. The note beneath it reads, seen twice by closing staff. Never disturbs. Sometimes bows. You flip to a news section, South America. A series of reports from a missionary archive in Quito describe nightly rearrangements of a single shelf of botanical texts. Always alphabetical. Always precise. A librarian spirit, one writer jokes, or simply a former monk with unresolved filing compulsions. You start to notice a pattern, Regardless of geography, the ghost-haunting libraries seem to favor the quiet arts. They sort, they tidy, they return mislaid things. If your average poltergeist knocks over vases, these prefer to adjust subject headings or misquote footnotes. That, or silently observe with passive-aggressive interest. A rare field report from Ghana tells of a wooden stool in a university reading room that never stays in its assigned corner. Each morning, it's found facing the window, as if watching the sunrise. Possibly ancestral presence, the librarian writes. Respects silence. Prefers politics section. Quirky tidbit. One librarian in Vienna recorded a dream in which a ghost led her to a misfiled manuscript. When she awoke, she searched the indicated shelf and found it, tucked behind a monograph on Hungarian bread-making. Scholars debate whether this proves subconscious filing memory or if the ghost simply had excellent navigational skills. You flip a few more pages. There's an Italian report from the Biblioteca Malatestiana, one of Europe's oldest libraries. A patron allegedly saw a man in monastic robes silently weeping beside a chained book. The account ends with, book later found to contain marginalia in the same handwriting. Possibly grief-related annotation. These accounts are careful, methodical. You picture dozens of librarians worldwide, all of them in wool, all of them armed with pencils and professional skepticism, comparing notes on spectral behavior like naturalists logging bird migrations. It's oddly comforting, this bureaucratic approach to the unexplainable. No exorcisms. No melodrama. Just quiet notations, categorized by region and indexed by cause, unfinished scholarship, misdirected spirits, atmospheric confusion, and a particularly charming section titled Hauntings of Aesthetic Preference. That's where ghosts who favor specific authors or genres are documented. One in Prague exclusively shifts French Romantic poetry to the featured display table. Another in Lisbon reportedly whispered corrections to a badly translated line of Ovid. You sit with that for a while. Somewhere along the line, the idea of ghost has softened for you. Less chain-rattling banshee and more spectral in turn. Helpful. Occasionally finicky. Always deeply invested in bibliographic accuracy. You mark your place with a tasseled ribbon and look around. The room has stilled further. The chandelier no longer sways. The air is neither cold nor warm, it simply exists. Balanced. Then a small sound. A thud, soft as punctuation, from behind the far shelf. You wait. Nothing follows. You consider investigating but choose, instead, to take it as a sign of contentment. Perhaps someone, or something, just reshelved something they'd finished. It's that kind of night. You rise slowly, back and shoulders easing into movement. You feel no fear. Only the kind of solemn curiosity that makes you wonder if ghosts, too, get annoyed when someone checks out the book they wanted. You pass through the room's carved archway into the next passage. The sign above it reads, Modernization and Misplacement, Spectral Incidents, since 1901. Apparently, the ghost stuck around well into the Edwardian period. And beyond. The corridor narrows again, lined with more modest shelves now, none of the grandeur of the older wings. Here, the spines are labeled with dry, institutional fonts. Typewritten. Functional. This is the post-Victorian section, where ghosts and cataloging meet the age of carbon copies and rotary phones. You're entering the years where the British library system began to modernize, slowly, begrudgingly, and with a great deal of clerical muttering. Filing systems grew more complex. Bureaucracy bloomed like a damp cellar rose. And yet, curiously, the reports of hauntings didn't stop. They just got duller. Take, for instance, the cataloging room anomaly of 1913. The file includes a memo from a junior archivist at the Bodleian, who swears a drawer in the main card index kept sliding open to the S section during her night shift. Always S. Never quite the same card. But the flap would be ajar, like an old dog begging you to look. When they eventually checked, they found a misfiled record, a book on Sir Simon de Canterville. Yes, that one, the inspiration behind Wilde's fictional Ghost. Misfiled under Simon's Domestic Servants. A mistake, perhaps. Or a literary in-joke. Historians still argue whether it was simple error or supernatural commentary on being forgotten in one's own library. Another report, 1927, comes from the British Museum reading room. A clerk noted a chill sensation between rows N, Q and the recurring appearance of an abandoned cup of tea on table 14, always in the exact same position. The tea was never warm, nor attributed to any registered user. The cleaning staff left it untouched, believing it to be part of some eccentric scholar's routine. It remained for 12 consecutive nights, then vanished. No stains. No explanation. As you flip through more pages, the tone of the reports becomes slightly more corporate. There are forms now, boxes to tick, incident codes, follow-up instructions. Yet the language still holds a whiff of unease. Unexplained displacement, recurrent item anomalies, and once, simply, file drawer behaved oddly, colleague witnessed, please advise. A favorite among them, the 1940 account of a night librarian at a regional branch in Yorkshire who reported a figure in a smoking jacket seated in the poetry alcove humming Greensleeves intermittently. When approached, the figure did not vanish. It reportedly looked up, said, "Sure," and gestured toward a volume of Byron. The staffer fainted. The poetry remained open to darkness. A coincidence? Maybe. But very on brand. You notice that, post-1900, there's a marked rise in ghostly encounters linked to noise complaints. Typewriters clicking when the room is empty. Phonograph recordings skipping where no machine exists. One particularly odd memo from 1955 mentions phantom whistling of unknown tune during Dewey Decimal recalibration. The sound was eventually traced to a leak in the boiler pipe, but only after the library's spiritual advisory panel had been summoned. Yes. By mid-century, some major libraries had spiritual advisory panels. Small teams, usually 2 or 3 people, trained to investigate potential hauntings while maintaining public calm and ensuring minimal disruption to library workflow. They often included an archivist, a retired vicar, and oddly enough, a gardener. The thinking was that no one understood quiet spaces better than the people who tended them. You skim a panel report from 1962, handwritten, by a Miss Ada Lovelace Rowntree, unrelated to that Ada Lovelace, though the name must have caused some raised brows. Ada investigated the Whaling catalog drawer of a small lending library in Devon. She determined it was likely a combination of warping wood, poor humidity control, and deeply suppressed librarian rage. Her final note reads, "Reassigned drawer to folklore section." Anomalies ceased. Quirky tidbit. By the 1970s, some libraries began using ghost stories in their orientation materials, not to scare, but to instill a sense of custodial reverence. Handle the books gently. You never know who's watching. Mildly spooky, extremely effective. Especially on new hires. You linger over a black and white photograph, grainy, with that peculiar 20th century bleakness, of a file room in the British Library. The caption reads, "Figure noted on second step of ladder, not present in person at time of capture." You squint. There it is. A faint shape, like smoke deciding to pretend it has form. Or a librarian returning to double-check a footnote. There's something quietly hilarious about how matter-of-fact these files are. No Ghostbusters. No hysteria. Just mild annoyance. Someone keeps flipping the atlas pages to Iceland. No record of patron. Probably harmless. Even the ghosts seem to have evolved with the times. No more chains or whales. Now it's sticky drawers, off-kilter indexes, books falling to the floor like they forgot how gravity works. One report describes a reappearance phenomenon in which a banned book kept returning to the new arrival's shelf. The title? On Being Haunted. Staff finally gave up and let it stay. Historians still debate whether these post-Victorian anomalies are true hauntings or the psychological fallout of overworked catalogers. After all, who among us hasn't hallucinated a whisper when indexing the full works of the Royal Society's 1892 Proceedings on Agricultural Mildew? You set the file aside and sit back. This section isn't as eerie as the older wings, but it's got a charm all its own. Ghosts who prefer cardstock can make their presence known by rearranging paperclips into pentagrams of mild disapproval. You stretch your fingers. There's a paper cut on one of them, just enough to sting. Probably from an overzealous file tab. Or perhaps the spirit of Miss Lovelace Rowntree reminding you to be more careful with archival integrity. A brass wall clock chimes somewhere nearby. Softly. Just once. The next hallway opens before you, lit by sconces that buzz faintly in a way that reminds you of summer insects. There's a plaque above the doorway, etched into dull brass. Occult lending, restricted access, and special permissions. You glance over your shoulder, just to check. The corridor behind you is empty. Of course it is. The door under the occult lending plaque swings open with a reluctant creak, the kind that feels less mechanical and more opinionated. Inside, the air is noticeably cooler. Not cold, exactly, but the kind of crispness usually reserved for church crypts or very old cheese cellars. You step forward. The carpeting, if you can call it that, is a faded crimson with mysterious darker patches that you hope are just overenthusiastic tea stains. This is where the library's haunted holdings live. Well, not officially. There's no section in any catalog labeled haunted books. Handle with mild dread. But everyone knows that certain texts in the collection have a reputation. The kinds of books that rearrange themselves on the shelf. Or fall open to a page that happens to answer a question you were only just forming in your head. The shelves in this room are shorter, but more densely packed. Many of the books are bound in cracked leather or vellum with handwritten spine labels. A surprising number have clasps, some simple brass, others baroque enough to qualify as small musical instruments. You walk slowly past a display case titled Bindings of Unusual Interest, containing a volume wrapped in eel skin and another allegedly stitched from unknown animal material, possibly ecclesiastical. One particularly worn tome near the entrance is marked with a crimson ribbon and a warning, consult only in pairs. You make a mental note to definitely not open that one without backup, or perhaps ever. Some ghosts, after all, are just looking for readers. Victorian librarians took their job very seriously, especially when it came to materials like this. The Society for Psychical Cataloging, yes, that was a real thing, was formed in 1874 to create protocols for anomalous literature. Their goal was to standardize the way haunted or supernaturally inclined texts were logged. That meant special shelving criteria, red ink classification tags, and in extreme cases, storage and lead-lined cabinets. One archived letter from a junior assistant at the London Library complains about having to wear cloves of garlic around her neck when working in the unexplained phenomena aisle. She notes that it made her popular with the cats and less so with her colleagues. You pass a table where a single candle flickers in a red glass holder. There's no draft. No open window. But the flame keeps leaning to the left, like it's trying to whisper a secret to the worn wooden tabletop. You do not ask it to elaborate. Scholars still argue whether these so-called haunted books were truly anomalous, or simply magnetized by human imagination and heavy atmosphere. After all, a room filled with tales of witches, revenants, and spectral premonitions is bound to influence the more impressionable parts of your brain. Especially at night. Especially when the lights flicker ever so slightly. Like that. Yes, just like that. A favorite tale among the staff involves a slim volume of folk rhymes from Devonshire that, for years, refused to stay put. Every time it was shelved, it would appear the next morning on a librarian's desk, open to the same page, a lullaby about a child who slept through a fire. Eventually, they stored it in a locked drawer. It stopped moving. But the drawer now hums faintly between 2 and 4 a.m., according to a footnote scribbled in the margin of the incident report. You lean in to inspect a case labeled temporarily misplaced by unseen forces. Inside are note cards, many handwritten, detailing which books went missing, how long they were gone, and how they reappeared. One vanished for 7 years, then showed up in a locked office no one had entered. Another returned wet, smelling of brine, and filled with sand. The book? A 19th-century translation of Tales of the Deep Ones. Coincidence? Of course. Probably. It wasn't just librarians who got involved. In 1889, the British Library briefly retained a literary medium named Mr. Thaddeus Wick, whose entire job was to hold seances near misplaced titles and ask, politely, if the spirits could return them. According to his final report, the success rate was moderate, but the sessions did greatly improve morale, particularly when accompanied by ginger biscuits. You pick up a slim black-bound ledger, marked only with the initials LMC inside, sparse entries dated between 1896 and 1904. Each line is a ghost sighting, dream, or odd coincidence linked to a specific book. Some are chilling. One just reads, heard Latin where there was none. Another, goose flesh every time I touched the spine, even in July. And another, requested by no one. Checked out by someone. Returned with a note, thank you for letting me finish. No patron record exists. There's a whispered reverence here, as if the books themselves are listening. You tread more carefully now, glancing at titles. The Weather and Apparitions in Sussex, Haunting as Historical Resistance, A Guide to Unremembered Saints. Quirky tidbit, in the early 1900s, one library created a sleep shelf specifically for books that induced drowsiness in readers after just a few pages. Several were ghost-related. Whether it was the writing or the subject matter, or perhaps some ghostly soporific leaking from the bindings, no one could agree. But many swore by the method. 3 pages in and you're nodding off, wrote one clerk, unless the shadows in the margins start moving first. You find a nook with a velvet chair and a green reading lamp. How delightfully cliché. You sit. You breathe. The air smells faintly of beeswax, pepper, and the kind of mustiness that can only be described as philosophically dusty. Around you, the shelves remain still. The books are quiet. But it's a watchful quiet. You wonder, briefly, how many of these volumes have never been checked out. How many have waited decades for someone to turn their pages. How many have whispered their contents to the shelves around them, trading lines of poetry for recipes for summoning foxes. You rest your hand on one cover, and for a moment your pulse slows. It's not sleep, but it's close. You sit for a while longer, barely shifting, as the books settle into their collective silence like cats finding the warmest spot in the sun. Somewhere, a page flutters of its own accord, or perhaps because the air moved just slightly when you exhaled. You're not sure anymore, and it doesn't seem to matter. The chair beneath you is worn in a way that welcomes your weight, like it's been waiting for this exact moment of stillness. Eventually, you rise and make your way to the other end of the occult lending room, where a narrow door leads into a far less dramatic space, the cataloging annex. Despite the lack of flickering candles or haunted bookcases, this room feels no less peculiar. It's bright, for one thing, sunlight filters in through high frosted windows, and the ceiling is high enough to allow ideas to echo faintly. This is where the ghost records live. Not ghost stories. Those are everywhere. This, instead, is the domain of librarians who, over the course of the 19th century, were tasked with documenting reported hauntings, unexplained noises, cold spots, dream visitations, and all manner of spectral encounters that happened in or around libraries, reading rooms, and archives. You know, just to be thorough. Because if there's anything more Victorian than believing in ghosts, it's filing them alphabetically. Rows of filing cabinets stretch across the room, their brass handles worn and familiar. Each drawer is labeled with a neat calligraphic hand: apparitions, basement to bell tower, phantom odors, A to Z, poltergeists, mild to interruptive, and even vanishing patrons, suspected spectral cases. You pick one at random and pull. The drawer slides out with a whisper, revealing hundreds of index cards. Each one is filled with meticulous observations. Some are dry and precise, clearly written by skeptics doing their duty. Others are dreamy, borderline poetic. Rustle heard at precisely 3:47 a.m., as though gown of silk moved across old floorboards. No source found. Smelled lavender and ink. Librarians, after all, are great noticers. They're also prone to long shifts, dim lighting, and the particular quiet that can unnerve the overly rational. So, it's perhaps no surprise that the ghost files became their own quiet tradition, a way to pass down stories between generations of caretakers and curators. One might even say the ghosts became a part of the staff. Historians still argue whether these files were created out of sincere belief or institutional boredom. Some suggest they began as a private joke, ghost reports scribbled on slow Tuesday afternoons. Others claim there was genuine conviction behind them, especially during the 1880s spiritualist boom, when table rapping, seances, and spectral photography were the stuff of drawing rooms and lecture halls alike. One file contains a sketch of a long-haired figure spotted repeatedly on the upper gallery of the Cambridge Reference Library. The sightings stopped, apparently, after the floors were revarnished, leading to the unusual theory that ghosts disliked the smell of turpentine. Another reports that a cold gust interrupted a librarian's tea break so forcefully that it turned the pages of a Latin grammar book and knocked over the sugar bowl. A favorite among the staff, lovingly preserved under plastic, details a recurring dream of one Mr. Hargrave, late of the Bodleian, a vision of a woman in green who whispered due dates, for books no longer in the collection. He dreamed of her for 9 nights, always at 2:11 a.m., until he finally removed a volume from the dusty back row and found inside it a letter addressed to him. Dated 3 years prior. Postmarked nowhere. Quirky tidbit: for a brief time in the 1890s, the British Library installed a ghost suggestion box after an unusual string of unexplained events: lights flickering, odd smells, books toppling. Patrons were invited to submit experiences anonymously. The box filled quickly. One child reported hearing someone humming "God Save the Queen" backwards. Another visitor claimed the building sang at sunset. The box was quietly removed after a particularly unsettling letter mentioned something under the floor. Back in the annex, you find a slim, cloth-bound ledger, green, with silver lettering, Records of Library Anomalies, Volume 1. You open it carefully. Inside, year-by-year entries, handwritten in looping script, each one beginning with a precise timestamp. These weren't just passing stories. They were logged, observed, added to an unofficial catalog that grew larger every year. October 12, 1884. 7:13 p.m. Cold sensation reported in Theology Aisle. Lasted 12 minutes. Coincided with flickering sconce. No electrical fault located. Notified Mr. Penrose. May 8, 1890. 4:41 p.m. Whispering heard between shelves. J.K. Investigated. Source unknown. Sound stopped when lantern was raised. You imagine the quiet seriousness with which these notes were taken. Not as drama. Not even as belief. Just careful observation. The librarian's version of if you see something, say something, except the thing you're seeing is translucent, and might be humming softly in Greek. Victorian catalogers, unlike modern ghost hunters, didn't carry EMF detectors or thermal cameras. They used ledgers. Ink. Patience. A cautious curiosity. They trusted patterns and page counts. And most importantly, they documented the unexplained with the same dignity they gave to census records or agricultural pamphlets. Which makes you think, maybe the point wasn't to prove anything. Maybe it was just to notice. To create a space for noticing. You close the ledger gently. It thuds softly, like a heartbeat underwater. You replace it on the shelf. The room hums faintly. You walk slowly now, taking it all in, the quiet cabinets, the scent of paper, the faint echo of time folded over on itself. This isn't a room where you find answers. It's a room where you record questions. One card at a time. Until the questions themselves feel like a kind of presence. And somehow, that feels enough. You slip back into the hallway, and for a few moments, you simply stand there, listening. Not for ghosts, exactly. Just for the quiet. The deep bell kind, where time seems to breathe through the plaster. And then you begin moving again, drifting farther into the underlayers of the building, through a narrow stairwell with worn stone steps, past a dusty clock that hasn't ticked in decades, and toward a small door labeled Staff Materials, Internal Use Only. It creaks open into what feels like an attic turned archive. No books here, at least, not in the usual sense. Instead, this is where the librarians stored oddities, ephemera, evidence. An entire room dedicated to cataloging not the ghosts themselves, but the stories about them. Stacks of yellowing pamphlets, annotated personal diaries, correspondence between librarians debating whether a patron who vanished mid-chapter had simply wandered off or dissolved into mist. A small collection of soot-smudged playing cards, apparently retrieved from a seance table, and a velvet-lined box labeled Spiritualist Paraphernalia. Do not mishandle. You leave it closed. You reach a shelf of loose-leaf papers bound with ribbon. These are the notes of Miss Lucinda Abernathy, head reference librarian from 1879 to 1903. Her penmanship is exquisite and slanted, the kind that suggests a lifelong tension between decorum and caffeine. Miss Abernathy was something of a legend among library staff, remembered as the one who kept a lavender sachet in every pocket, and claimed she could smell a haunting before it started. Her writings are a kind of dream journal, but one filtered through carbon copies, candlelight, and a deep love of the Dewey Decimal System. Dreamt again of room 23, she writes. Same cold draft. Same figure in rustling silk. Consulted floor plans. There is no room 23. She underlines it twice. Another entry reads, encountered Mr. Dillingham in East Wing. Reports repeated tapping sound between shelves 914 and 915. Investigated. Sound ceased upon recitation of Psalm 91. Coincidence? Investigate further. Miss Abernathy, it seems, took her ghost seriously, but not sensationally. She logged each report alongside the temperature, humidity, and what kind of tea she had been drinking. This was a woman who knew that belief needed context. And also caffeine. Historians still argue whether figures like Abernathy were archivists of the unexplained or participants in it. Were they observers? Mediums? Clever women using ghost hunting as a respectable outlet for curiosity in an age when certain kinds of inquiry were frowned upon? You suspect the answer is a little of each. You tuck her papers back into their ribbon. A small metal box beside them catches your attention. Inside, folded letters from patrons describing supernatural encounters. Some are brief, even childish. Others stretch on for pages. One includes a diagram of where a ghost was last seen, complete with compass directions and a tiny drawing of a librarian clutching her spectacles. Quirky tidbit. One Victorian librarian, Mr. Horace Witherby, created an entire alternate catalogue for books rumored to be haunted. It wasn't part of the public system, just a handwritten ledger kept in his desk. It included cross-references like, may emit whispers after dark or moved without assistance on 3 verified occasions. His fellow staff found it hilarious, until his notes led them to uncover a stash of forgotten volumes, sealed in a bricked-up chamber behind the biography section. The titles? All copies of The Mirror's Secret, a book so dry it could only be haunted by boredom itself. You turn a corner and find an unlabeled cabinet. Inside are envelopes. Dozens of them. All addressed, in the same hand, to the spirit that walks the stacks. None are opened. You lift one. The note inside reads, we do not fear you, but we would like to understand you. Please reply. It's unsigned. Another reads, if you return the key, we'll stop asking questions. Chilling. But the drawer where it came from smells faintly of clothes and lemon polish, so you decide to not be too alarmed. There's something deeply comforting about all this. Not the ghosts, but the care, the attention, the ritual of inquiry. These weren't people trying to prove anything. They were just listening, noticing, making a record in case someone else needed it later. You pull open another drawer. Inside, a pair of spectacles, an embroidered handkerchief, a pressed violet, and a card labeled, items found in room 7, post-sighting. Unclaimed. You don't recognize the name of the librarian who filed it. You wonder if they're still around, or if they, too, became part of the archive. The air here smells of old ink and furniture polish. Of memory, somehow, and not the recent kind. You close the drawer gently and rise. It's time to move on. But as you reach the door, you pause and look back at the room. The filtered light. The slanted shelves. The quiet companionship of those who catalogued strangeness with grace, precision, and perhaps just a touch of theatrical flair. And suddenly, you realize something odd. You never turned on a lamp. And yet, somehow, the room was always just bright enough. You close the small door behind you and return to the main corridor, footsteps muffled by threadbare carpet and the steady hush that seems to settle over institutions where memory outweighs function. The library has shifted again, subtly. You can feel it. The temperature's dropped just a whisper, and the lights have gone a bit more golden, like the air is leaning toward sepia. Back in the central catalog room, a librarian dusts a shelf with the reverence of someone rearranging a cathedral. You give a polite nod and slip past, making your way into a curious space tucked between the geography section and something labeled ephemeral accounts. The brass placard on the door simply reads, "The Index of Hauntings." You hesitate. Then push the door. Inside, it's neither gloomy nor foreboding. In fact, the room feels almost too ordinary, until you notice the filing system. Row upon row of neat wooden drawers, each tagged with a brass plate etched in painstaking script: apparitions, window-based, vocal phenomena, infrequent, floorboard disturbances, unverified. You blink. And then, almost against your better judgment, you start exploring. You pull open a drawer labeled Shelf Whispers, 1880 to 1889. Inside, dozens of small index cards, each one meticulously notated. December 3, 1881. Patron reports hearing name called 3 times near nautical maps. Voice described as male, mid-Atlantic accent. No one present. No nautical maps in vicinity. You imagine someone squinting in that direction, heart racing, only to realize they're standing next to local history pamphlets instead. A few cards include annotations in different handwriting, cross-referenced, debated, updated. Some events reclassified years later as explainable: drafts, faulty plumbing, or a loose floorboard mistaken for a spirit footstep. Others remain marked undetermined, which is the librarian's polite way of saying, well, something happened. You find an entire drawer devoted to spectral smells. You hadn't thought to imagine a ghostly aroma, but here it is, violet cologne, appearing during cataloging of 1700s travelogues. Burnt sugar smell, consistent with manifestation near the Dickens collection. Ozone and lavender, linked to recurring cold spot and archive staircase. Someone even added a note at the bottom, possibly linked to overuse of scented handkerchiefs by Miss Abernathy. Or not. Historians still argue whether these notes reflect genuine phenomena or simply a collective act of low-level creative hallucination. Was the Index of Hauntings an earnest attempt at classification, or just an elaborate form of staff bonding? After all, what better team-building exercise than trying to out-document a ghost? Quirky tidbit: in 1902, the Index was nearly retired after a rather stern internal memo deemed it a distraction from real cataloging. The staff protested by presenting their argument in full Victorian fashion, a 32-page report, bound in embossed leather, complete with ink-washed illustrations and a poem titled Ode to the Whispering Stack. The administration relented. The Index stayed. You flip to a section called Books That Misplaced Themselves. There's an entry from 1887 about a rare copy of the Sleepy Herald, a pamphlet known for inducing naps even among the most hardened academics. It reportedly disappeared 3 times, each time reappearing on a different floor. Eventually, they stopped trying to shelve it and simply let it wander. You find a folded sheet tucked into one of the deeper drawers. A hand-drawn map of the library, but not any official floor plan. This one includes annotations in red ink: cold patch, staticky corner, shelf 47B, avoid after dusk. Someone added little swirling lines where unexplained breezes have been felt and dotted stars where sightings were most likely to recur. One area is circled in bold. Do not investigate alone. You decide to skip that part of the map. Instead, you follow a thread of entries that seem to focus on one persistent entity, the reader. A shadowy figure described by multiple librarians over the decades, always seated at the same table, always flipping a book that no one else could see. No face discernible, one card notes, but turning pages audible up to 5 feet away. Another adds seems to favor quiet hours. Does not respond when addressed. Possibly shy. Some think the reader was a former staff member, perhaps a clerk who passed away mid-shift. Others suggested simply the collective manifestation of everyone who ever stayed past closing time. You pause to wonder what it would take for you to become part of the index. If you linger long enough, would they write you in? Wandering presence, fond of peppermint, known to hum quietly and disturb index card order. The room, for all its talk of ghosts, doesn't feel spooky. It feels meticulous. Cozy, in the way only bureaucracy can be when wielded with affection. The drawers, the labels, the long dead pens, they're like love letters to the unknowable, filed by people who never expected answers, only wanted to leave the question better organized. You find a drawer that hums faintly when you touch it. You don't open it. You just let your fingers rest there for a moment, then move on. Outside the room, the air feels crisper, like a window's been opened somewhere far above. You don't check your watch. You're not sure how long you've been here, but you feel steadier, as though the strange has settled, at least for now, into something as tidy and warm as a library drawer. And really, that's all you need. You drift back into the main gallery, shoes whispering across polished floorboards, your fingertips grazing the spines of books as if asking permission. The lighting has softened to a kind of buttery amber, and there's a hush now not of absence, but of anticipation. Something in the library seems to hold its breath. A sign catches your eye, simple lettering on a worn wooden placard, Correspondence Archives. You follow the arrow, winding through narrower corridors and past locked cabinets, until you reach a room filled entirely with drawers. Not for files. For letters. This is where things become personal. Victorian librarians, it turns out, didn't just collect ghost stories, they received them. Hundreds over decades. Letters from townsfolk, travelers, scholars, even clergy. Most arrived anonymously or under peculiar pseudonyms. A concerned bachelor, the vicar with no clock, Mrs. T, of Sidmouth. Each envelope was preserved, each page pressed and catalogued. You pull open one labeled Unclassified Reports, 1872. Inside, a sheaf of aging parchment, ink faded, script careful but clearly rattled. One note describes a woman hearing her deceased husband's snore echo through a closed study door, despite his having passed the previous spring. Another recounts the sound of boots pacing beneath a nursery window every Thursday at dusk, even when the ground was empty. Some are detailed, almost embarrassingly so. One particularly long letter outlines the habits of a phantom gardener who continues pruning the hedges of a long-demolished estate. The writer claims to have seen him shaking his head at the lilac's condition. You smile, imagining a ghost more disappointed in landscaping than eternity. Historians still argue whether these letters represent genuine experiences or a kind of psychological confessional, a way for people to express grief, guilt, or worry in a society that prided itself on stoic restraint. After all, if you couldn't tell your neighbor you miss your husband's voice, perhaps you could write the library instead, wrap it in parchment, and let it rest among the papers. One particularly odd entry stands out. The envelope is sealed with red wax, unbroken. On the outside, do not open unless necessary. Underneath, in another hand, someone has scribbled, define necessary. You leave it closed. Further along the shelves, you discover a drawer marked Staff Sightings, internal use only. Inside are notes, from the librarians themselves, jotted on scraps of paper, not meant for public view. August 1883, books in sorrow and remembrance moved again. No one assigned to shelf. Note, return to old layout seemed to soothe. October 1891, candle flickered 3 times when I thought about Miss Penberry. Coincidence? February 1904, cold hand on shoulder during inventory. Thought it was Stanley. Stanley on sick leave. There's something almost tender in these confessions, little moments scribbled in haste, without agenda. Not part of any formal investigation. Just the human need to record. To say, this happened, and I was here. You find a peculiar folder labeled Rejected Submissions. These are the stories deemed too fanciful even for the ghost files. One man claimed to have seen a ghost horse galloping through the poetry section. Another swore that his dreams changed depending on which floor he read on. And then there's the woman who insisted the card catalog whispered old lovers' names when she tried to research her genealogy. Even the outlandish ones were saved. Nothing was thrown away. There's a reverence here, not for the supernatural itself, perhaps, but for the people brave or desperate or curious enough to speak it aloud. Quirky tidbit: the library briefly hosted ghost mornings in the early 1900s, select hours when patrons were invited to share spectral experiences without ridicule. Tea was served. Notes were taken. Attendance was high, particularly among women over 50 and underpaid clerks who seemed oddly eager to discuss floating lights of a personal nature. Eventually, the program was retired. Not because of scandal or disbelief, but because the librarians realized they were amassing more anecdotes than they could reasonably index. You pause at a case labeled Correspondence with the Beyond. It holds letters not about ghosts, but to them. Yes, really. Some are humorous. To whoever keeps opening Volume 3 of the Linnean Herbal, if you want to read it, kindly do so during daylight hours. Sincerely, E. Bramble. Others are heartbreaking. Mother, if you can still hear me, I forgive everything. Even the apple seller. The strangest one might be the letter addressed to the unknown reader upstairs. The writer thanks the ghosts for always returning the volumes to the correct shelf and apologizes for the overheated radiators. They sign it, your devoted assistant, forever shelving. It's hard to say what's more fascinating, the idea that ghosts might read, or that humans thought to write them letters in return. You sit for a while on a bench at the edge of the room, surrounded by words that were never meant to be published, only preserved. Everything here feels fragile but stubborn. Like memory itself, fluttering, half-legible, determined to outlast the dust. Outside you hear the creak of pipes, the distant squeal of a book trolley. The library lives. You tuck a stray card back into place and wonder if your name will one day end up in a drawer like this, tagged and filed and misremembered. And somehow, the thought doesn't frighten you. You leave the letter drawers behind, retracing your steps through the quiet labyrinth. Each turn in the library seems to yield a new kind of silence, some corners thick and thoughtful, others almost cheeky, like they're waiting to be found out. You follow your instincts now, or maybe just a sense of drowsy momentum, and wind up in the map room. This is where ghosts go global. Every wall is lined with oversized atlases, rolled charts, delicate globe models, and sea-battered navigational maps pinned under glass. Victorian librarians, being the highly specific breed they were, took it upon themselves not just to gather ghost sightings but to plot them. Geographies of the paranormal. Atlases of the odd. You run a finger along one enormous parchment titled A Tentative Cartograph of the Spirit World as Intersecting London, 1862 to 1899. It's color-coded, with tiny gold leaf stars marking notable hauntings. You spot familiar names, Highgate, Kensington, Whitechapel, and unfamiliar annotations like Lady in Mauve, intermittent, or soft wailing, probable wind. Or the deeply British, persistent odor. Possibly supernatural. Possibly bad plumbing. In the center of the room stands a massive globe that doesn't spin. Instead, its surface is riddled with hundreds of tiny ink dots. When you look closer, you realize each one corresponds to a reported ghost sighting, complete with date and file number. A ghostly longitude and latitude. Historians still argue whether these maps were a sincere attempt to track patterns, or just a very elaborate way for board clerks to justify their funding. Either way, the result is hypnotic. Whole regions seem thick with sightings, moors, ruins, port towns. And almost none in the Lake District, which one marginal note attributes to the damp scaring them off. Nearby, a corkboard holds correspondence and pinned clippings. A clipping from the Times, headline Apparition Disrupts Council Vote, sits beside a scrawled note, Ghost Opposed to Gas Tax? There's a postcard from Calcutta describing a flickering presence in the rare manuscript's wing, and a telegram from a missionary in Africa wondering whether the shade in the rafters qualifies for inclusion. The librarians didn't limit themselves to Britain. Victorian fascination with the paranormal traveled just as far as their ships. Accounts arrived from Canada, India, Egypt, the Caribbean, each one filed, annotated, and sometimes skeptically marked with a tiny hand-drawn question mark. You find a chart titled Colonial Echoes, Ghosts Abroad and Their Curious Behavior. It reads less like a scientific document, and more like a Victorian travel guide. Spirits in Bengal more prone to olfactory phenomena. Nairobi, high incidence of spectral animals, goats, notably. Port of Spain, one persistent case of rhythmic knocking, unexplained, polite. Quirky tidbit: one overzealous researcher compiled a comparative chart of ghost frequencies by climate, theorizing that temperate zones produced more stable phantasms, while tropical environments yielded erratic visitations, likely due to ambient humidity. This same scholar later tried to convince Parliament to invest in spectral barometry. He was politely ignored. You pause at a framed letter that seems to be written by a diplomat to the library, thanking them for clarifying the nature of the thing that howls in the embassy's east stairwell. The postscript reads, "Turns out it was a bat. But a learned bat." On another table rests a book labeled Itinerant Hauntings, Ghosts with the Travel Itch. Inside, stories abound of spirits that don't stay put, ones that appear in different cities at different times, as if conducting some leisurely posthumous tour. One file references the suitcase ghost, allegedly seen in multiple train compartments across 5 counties. Another lists the Whisperer of Brighton, who reportedly moved up the coast 1 pier at a time. You sit for a moment in an old chair meant for map reading, though it groans dramatically under you, perhaps in protest. The globe to your left creaks faintly, as if it's thinking of spinning just once for a show. It's easy to forget, here among the papers and pushpins, that most of these sightings were never meant to scare. They weren't jump scares or demonic intrusions. They were quieter things, footsteps where there shouldn't be footsteps. The sense of not being alone in a very empty place. The sound of breathing when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes, the ghost wasn't the story, it was the excuse. For a creaky house, a sleepless night, or a mood you couldn't quite shake. And so the librarians mapped it. Not to prove or disprove, but simply to notice. Because noticing is a kind of respect. Even for the strange. Especially for the strange. You trail your fingers along a map marked Spectral Hotspots of Greater Manchester, 1870s edition. Each district marked with a symbol, an eye for apparitions, a flame for unexplained lights, a bell for auditory events. It looks like a ghost-themed board game. One margin note reads, Salford, noisy again. Suspect overexcited schoolboys or unquiet monks. There's even a wall-mounted weather vane that, apparently, once spun according to paranormal winds, though now it just hangs quietly, collecting dust and the occasional librarian's sigh. You flip through the visitor logbook. Several patrons over the decades appear to have had unplanned encounters. One entry simply says, "Book flew off shelf. Please advise." Another, "Smelled violets. No violets present. Sat down anyway." The last one, dated decades ago, is the most Victorian of them all, "Saw a ghost. Declined to engage. Reshelved quietly. It's getting late, or early. Time is beginning to dissolve in the way it often does when you're surrounded by so many things that came before you. You don't feel haunted. You feel accompanied. You rise, legs stiff, eyes a little glassy. It's time to move on. But not before you take one last look at the globe. You wonder which dot, if any, marks this very room. And whether someday, someone will add one more. You move on, softer now, as if your own presence is becoming part of the hush. A faint creak echoes beneath your feet, floorboards trained to notice. At the far end of a corridor, a narrow staircase beckons. The banister is polished by thousands of gliding hands. You take it slowly. Each step down feels like peeling back another layer of time. The air shifts again, cooler, thicker, slightly metallic. You arrive in the archive annex. This is not where the glamorous ghost stories live. No famous hauntings. No headless nobleman galloping through corridors. This is where the footnotes sleep, the forgotten sightings, the dismissed letters, the sketches filed under miscellaneous, likely nonsense. Which, of course, makes it the most interesting room in the entire building. The lighting here is different, low but steady. Sconces hum quietly, casting amber glows over rows of archival drawers and unlabeled folios. It feels like stepping into the subconscious of the library itself. The place where even the librarians aren't entirely sure what's been catalogued. You drift to the first cabinet. The drawer sticks, then yields, revealing a folder labeled Partial Manifestations. Inside, dozens of notes describing sightings that couldn't be classified. A woman's reflection that didn't match her expression. A shadow that paused politely to let someone pass. The smell of cinnamon where no one had baked in weeks. Historians still argue whether this annex was ever officially sanctioned or whether it was a quiet rebellion, a collection built by eccentric archivists who refused to let a good story vanish just because it didn't meet spectral protocol. You find a logbook of dreams donated anonymously. No names, no dates. Just detailed accounts of dreams in which people encountered what they believed to be ghosts, usually familiar faces, sometimes just voices. Once or twice a house I didn't know but somehow remembered. One quirky entry stands out: dreamt of my childhood dog speaking Latin. Woke up with the distinct scent of coal smoke. No fire lit. Miss him terribly. Tucked behind the folders is a slim volume with hand-sewn binding, Unconfirmed Whisperings, 1873 to 1881. It reads like a poetry collection. Short descriptions, often no more than a sentence, and yet deeply vivid. Breath on the mirror when I hadn't exhaled. The rocking chair stopped when I looked at it. Keys found in my shoe. Again. You keep reading, each entry a little stranger, a little sadder. Window open. Cat missing. Footprints by the sill, human-sized. Heard piano scales. No pianos since 1859. Mother says the corner is colder. I told her corners are meant to be. Some pages are marked with tiny sigils in faded ink, drawn by hands that clearly believed these reports deserved ritual respect. There's no index. No organizational system. Just memory, and the refusal to forget. On one shelf, you spot a dusty hatbox labeled Voice Recordings, wax cylinders. Next to it, a hand-lettered warning: do not play after dusk unless accompanied. You leave it alone. Not out of fear, but because even curiosity has bedtime manners. Further back, you come across a large wooden crate. The tag reads, Sensory Accounts, Non-Visual. It contains boxes categorized by sensation: touch, smell, temperature, auditory. You pull open the touch box and find a single folded paper. A hand on mine in the dark. Calloused. Warm. Not there when I turned on the lamp. The smell box is more crowded. So many fragments. Lilacs in January. Sulfur in church. Ink and smoke, like Father's study, though he's been gone 10 years. And the eerie simplicity of salt. Only salt. No ocean nearby. There's something quietly profound in the idea that even these fleeting sensations were worth saving. That someone cared enough to document not just sights and sounds, but the strange ways a ghost might gently nudge the senses. You rest a hand on the cabinet's edge. It's smooth, but faintly warm. Someone must have touched it recently. Or maybe the room itself remembers. In the back corner stands a reading table, carved oak, with legs shaped like scrolls. One lone candle flickers in a brass holder. You sit, not because you're tired, but because the chair is inviting in the way only well-used furniture can be. As if it's held centuries of slow readers and whispered stories. On the table lies a stack of blank library forms. The kind used for request slips or patron notes. Someone's written on the top one, not all ghosts need names. Some just need space. It's unsigned. You stare at it longer than you mean to. Nearby, a shelf holds a row of jars, glass stoppered with wax. Each one contains a different object. A faded glove. A pressed violet. A tiny bell. None are labeled. They might be relics of hauntings, or just donations from patrons who didn't want to throw something away. You can't tell. You don't need to. You feel it, don't you? That soft pull at the edge of your thoughts. Not fear. Not even unease. Just the sense of having entered a room that was waiting for you. You get up and return the drawers, slowly and carefully, as if the contents inside were sleeping. As you turn to go, something faint brushes your arm. Not a touch exactly, just the feeling that someone else is moving in the opposite direction. You pause, look back. Nothing there. But the candle flickers twice, as if winking goodbye. You climb the stairs again. The hush doesn't leave you. It tucks into your coat, follows in your footsteps. The annex may be the quietest part of the library, but it's also the most alive. The hush follows you up the staircase, like a polite ghost escorting you back to the land of indexed knowledge. Your feet feel slower now, not out of weariness, exactly, but in the way that minds move more gently after being brushed by something strange. At the top of the stairs, the hallway yawns wider, leading you to a part of the library less often visited, even by its own staff. This is the administrative wing. Less glamour, fewer stories, but critical to understanding how a place like this actually worked. And how, against all odds, ghost records ended up being processed like overdue gardening manuals. You enter an office marked Registrar of Non-Material Occurrences. The plaque is crooked, as if unsure of itself. The room inside is papered in a faded print, ivy vines or maybe lightning bolts, depending on how your eyes adjust. And everywhere, stacked in precise, uneasy towers, are forms. Pages, folders, ledgers. Every one filled with reports of ghostly events, and not just reports, but correspondence. Letters to local officials, appeals to ecclesiastical authorities, memos between anxious librarians arguing over classification codes. You lift a bundle wrapped in string. The top form reads, Incident 344B, persistent tapping on reference room window, despite absence of trees or rain. Notes in the margin, birds? Wind? Spectre? Final verdict, inconclusive. Logged. Victorians were admirably formal about everything, including the unknowable. If a ghost knocked, you filed the report. If it left slime, you preserved the wallpaper sample. And if it whispered your name in Old Norse, well, that went to the language department. Historians still argue whether these formalities were sincere attempts at investigation, or simply a way for bureaucrats to tidy up the chaos of the uncanny. Either way, the paper trail is exquisite. One stack catches your attention, marked Rejected Reports. The reasons for rejection range from insufficient detail to unverified eyewitness to the charmingly vague too weird. One such report details a ghost that appeared only when someone sneezed twice in a row. Another described a haunted scarf, though the haunting consisted solely of a persistent feeling of nostalgia. A few of the rejected entries are marked with red wax seals and the words File Elsewhere. You can't help wondering where elsewhere is. You flip through the correspondence folders next. There's a lovely letter from a man in Surrey. Dear Sirs, I believe my cat is seeing someone I cannot. He stares with great concentration at an empty stairwell between 3:12 and 3:19 each morning. Please advise. The librarian's response, in crisp cursive, Dear Sir, kindly submit documentation of the cat's observations using Form A17, Domestic Animal Witness Statements. We thank you for your continued vigilance. One particularly extensive exchange involves the classification committee trying to decide whether a sound like sobbing that made the wallpaper damp counts as an auditory event, a physical manifestation, or both. They eventually compromised with trans-dimensional moisture event, and moved on to the next debate, whether ghosts should be assigned Dewey Decimal numbers. You discover that they tried. Oh, how they tried. There's a draft of proposed categories. 133.1 Standard Apparitions. 133.2 Haunted Objects, Non-Lethal. 133.3 Spectral Sounds. 133.4 Emotional Residues. 133.5 Time Loops and Residual Hauntings. 133.6 Undetermined Whisperings. And a final, scratched-out entry, 133.7 Ghosts who are actually librarians, possible but unverifiable. One fringe tidbit tucked in the back of a folder. Someone once proposed that ghosts could be alphabetized by the dominant emotion they evoke. Fear, sorrow, guilt, longing. That way, the note reads, visitors may better prepare themselves emotionally. The proposal was never approved, but you imagine what the shelves might have looked like, spines marked with golden teardrops or lightning bolts. The registrar's desk is littered with stamps, many of them bespoke. Approved for haunting. Requires prayer. Refer to Witchcraft Subcommittee. And your favorite, good story, bad data. You notice a logbook labeled volunteer indexers. A whole register of people who, in their spare time, helped organize this ghostly bureaucracy. Their comments are delightful. Entry 1907 to 34 smells faintly of perfume. No one touched it for hours. Misfiled one poltergeist under polenta. Will fix tomorrow. Please remind staff that shrieking from the archive floor is not necessarily paranormal. There's even a section for anonymous comments. Sometimes I come here just to feel less alone. It's here, amid the folder tabs and fine handwriting, that you sense the heart of the project. These weren't just papers. They were invitations, for participation, for storytelling, for the very human need to say, something happened, and I want someone to believe me. In the far corner of the office, a thin cabinet marked unopened envelopes draws your eye. There must be hundreds, maybe thousands. All sealed. All sent in by citizens hoping their story would be heard. Some likely contain nonsense. Others heartbreak. Maybe one or two contain a truth we haven't quite figured out how to name. You don't open any. Not out of respect, necessarily, but because they don't need to be opened to matter. Their existence is enough. As you step back from the desk, the clock above ticks once, as if registering your departure. You leave the registrar's office feeling oddly buoyant. As though someone has reassured you that being curious, even about ridiculous things, is worthwhile. That even in the face of mystery, paperwork has its place. And maybe, just maybe, ghosts prefer it when their stories come with endnotes. You find yourself slipping down a narrower corridor now, one with low ceilings and gas lamps that hiss softly with the effort of staying lit. The hallway smells faintly of beeswax and old ink, like the scent of diligence itself. The brass signs become more cryptic. Ephemeral resources. Temporal indexing. Special collections, ethereal. Clearly, someone here had a fondness for mystery, or a budget for unusual brass. Eventually, you push through a swinging door that creaks in perfect harmony with the ghostly mood and arrive in a dim reading room labeled the night desk. No one's here. Or rather, no one's visible. A single lamp burns low over an ornate desk, where a sign rests that reads, "Open 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., for urgent inquiries only." The night desk is a legend in some corners of Victorian London, an oddball institution within an oddball institution. Meant for the truly restless researcher or the deeply haunted citizen, it accepted visitors when the city was at its quietest, and its stories most willing to emerge. Here, over countless years, librarians met with insomniacs, mediums, minor nobles, and clergymen with secrets. They listened, nodded, and occasionally pulled a thick leather tome from behind the desk marked unverified yet intriguing. You take a seat in one of the old armchairs nearby, the kind with velvet so worn it feels like suede. In front of you is a logbook, the night desk ledger, its entries dated and handwritten in a looping scrawl. The first one reads, October 3, 1856. Gentleman reports hearing Gregorian chants in his chimney. Not currently affiliated with a monastery. The entries go on from there, each stranger than the last. Woman claims her rocking chair rocks only when she thinks uncharitable thoughts. Boy delivers book donation. All volumes blank except for the phrase "not yet." Elderly man requests exorcism of mirror. Mirror insists it has done nothing wrong. Historians still argue whether the night desk was an earnest attempt at public service or a delightful stunt designed to enhance the library's mystique. It certainly wasn't advertised in standard guides. You had to know someone, or stumble across it by accident, as you just did. One rather touching story tucked into the ledger describes a mother who visited nightly for a week, not with a ghost problem, but to read aloud to the spirit of her daughter. She liked stories, the entry notes, especially ones with dragons and sensible governesses. You run your fingers along the desk. It's carved with initials and faint patterns that resemble constellations, or possibly attempts at warding symbols. There's a drawer slightly ajar. Inside, tiny silver bells, a bottle labeled ether, mild, and a crumbling biscuit that may have been ceremonial or just forgotten. Fringe practices abounded around the night desk. Some visitors brought objects to be read: locks of hair, letters, bits of crumbling brick from allegedly haunted walls. Others came with questions and were handed a card that read, "The answer lies in Dewey Decimal 398.25. And they'd go, obediently, into the stacks. Some found useful texts. Others returned with books so obscure they may not have existed before the query. One librarian claimed a tome once vanished as soon as its mystery was solved. It returned to the ether, he said, with the kind of face that dared you to argue. Of course, not everyone believed. A few skeptics came just to poke fun, leaving behind fake reports or sketching rude cartoons in the margins of ghost sighting forums. The night desk handled them all with equal calm. Every haunting is someone's truth, one note in the training manual read, even if the someone is mostly being dramatic. There's an index drawer marked repeat visitors. You open it. Dozens of cards, all neatly arranged. Some patrons came back nightly, their questions evolving slowly. Why do I dream in Latin? Becomes do ghosts learn languages? Which then becomes, has anyone documented bilingual hauntings? There's a certain comfort in this paper trail. A sense of people reaching out, not just to the beyond, but to each other. To a place that wouldn't laugh. That would say, "We've heard stranger." Fill out a form. You scan the shelves behind the desk. Books on folklore, theology, old medical theories. One is titled Spectral Hygiene, Clean Living for the Spiritually Overcrowded. Another, How to Host a Polite Seance. A third, clearly well-thumbed, is called When Lamps Flicker Without Wind, a field guide. One quirky librarian, there's a plaque in his honor, once categorized ghost-related ailments by weather patterns. Rain ghosts caused damp socks and melancholy. Fog ghosts prompted poor judgment and wistful poetry. Thunder ghosts were rare but dramatic, often associated with lost love and windows opening by themselves. His classification system was never adopted, but he's remembered fondly in the margins of the night desk ledger. Arthur. Often wrong, but beautifully so. You lean back. The lamp crackles softly. You could sit here for hours, and perhaps people did. There's a softness to this room that encourages wondering. Not believing necessarily, but letting belief brush past your sleeve now and then. And as the hour edges toward dawn, the last entry on the open page catches your eye. It reads simply, April 1st, 1892. Visitor claims they've come from the future. Says they're writing it all down. Seems harmless. Left behind a notebook with the word Section 17 written in the corner. Odd. You smile. And close the ledger. You step softly away from the night desk, the hush of the ledger still clinging to your thoughts like cobweb threads. The corridor seems longer now, as if time has stretched slightly within the library's walls. You pass another sign, half-tilted, marked Librarians Lounge, authorized only. Naturally, you nudge the door open. The room beyond is unexpectedly homey. A glowing hearth, two wing-back chairs with mismatched cushions, and a side table sagging under a mound of shortbread and stacked volumes. No one is here, at least not visibly, but there's a fresh indentation in the chair nearest the fire. You take it. This, as it turns out, is where the keepers of Victorian ghost files sometimes gathered to decompress. The work, while not physically taxing, was peculiar in ways that required a shared sigh now and then. You imagine them here in wool waistcoats and soft slippers, sipping weak tea, trading notes about phantasmal misfilings and spine-chilling misprints. One story, scrawled inside a dogged manual wedged between the couch cushions, tells of a poltergeist prank where all the ghost files were alphabetized backward one night. Took 2 weeks to catch it. The librarians weren't angry, just impressed. Historians still argue whether these internal anecdotes, these miniature mythologies, were wholly invented or slightly documented fact. After all, librarians are keepers of knowledge, but also champions of mystery. What better place to blur the line? There's a corkboard on one wall, pinned with curious notices. Reminder: replace salt sachets weekly, especially in reference. Lost. One annotated Ouija board, likely shelved under 306.9. New staff tea blend, chamomile plus vervain. Warning: may enhance lucid dreams. Beneath those is a handwritten quote: what is shelved may rise again. It's unclear if that's an inside joke or a shelving policy. The lounge feels less like a workplace and more like a club. A fellowship of the quietly bemused. These weren't ghost hunters. They didn't brandish crucifixes or swing incense. They catalogued. They stapled, stacked, labeled, and preserved. They made haunting administrative. You rise and explore a bit. On one shelf, there's a binder titled Unofficial Vocabulary of the Spirit Touched. Inside, a glossary of terms invented by librarians to describe recurring phenomena. Shelf slither, when books shift down a row overnight. Cold drafts, manuscripts that cool when opened, no matter the room. Banshee bounce, a misplaced scream recorded in the acoustics of a certain hallway. Some of these may have been jokes. Some may not. You open a side drawer and find an envelope labeled Tea Leaves, confidential. Inside, a crinkled note with a tiny sketch of a teacup and the phrase, 3 leaves equals upcoming visitor. 5 equals restless archivist. 6 or more equals misfiled prophecy. You wonder briefly how many librarians took that seriously. Then again, maybe not seriously, but with the respectful irreverence that defines so many rituals in this place. Another binder rests on a nearby table, this one titled Spectral Bookmarks, a compendium of where ghosts pause their reading. It lists odd page numbers repeatedly cited by visitors, 53, 147, and occasionally 92. No consensus on what these pages share, other than mild discomfort. A well-thumbed index card flutters from between its pages. You catch it. In neat script, it reads, most ghosts prefer nonfiction. Something about unresolved facts feels cozy. Quirky? Certainly. But also oddly comforting. One librarian's diary, preserved in yet another volume, describes her encounters with a sighing presence in the microfilm room. Not threatening, just exasperated. As though it had been trying to locate a footnote for decades. She named it Professor Wiggins and left it fresh annotations every Friday. To keep it feeling involved, she wrote. You sip an imaginary cup of tea and glance at the fire. The logs shift quietly, giving off a little pop, just enough to suggest company. Behind a screen near the hearth, you find the break table, which appears to double as a crafting corner. Scattered bits of ribbon, dried lavender, pressed wax seals, and blank index cards in pastel hues. One envelope reads, for hauntings of a seasonal nature. This is where the staff prepared appeasement packets, gentle gestures to restless spirits, a sachet of herbs, a quote from a favorite poet, sometimes a small photograph of a garden path or a cat napping in the sun. Did it help? Hard to say. But the librarians believed in acknowledging their invisible visitors. To ignore was rude. To engage, simply polite. Historians still puzzle over how seriously the profession took these side practices. The official records speak of them in vague terms, supplementary rituals and environmental harmonizations. But if you read between the lines of memos and marginalia, it's clear, belief wasn't required. Care was. A note tucked inside a journal near the break table reads, we don't always believe in ghosts. But we believe in the people who do. That's the thread running through it all. Not ghost busting. Not mystery chasing. But respect. A willingness to meet someone's story where it lives, even if that's somewhere between the stacks and the uncanny. You settle again into the chair by the fire. It creaks like a sigh. Your eyes drift to a little bell on the mantel, labeled for the attentive spirit. You ring it once softly. Nothing happens. But the room feels warmer. And that, in this lounge of half-jokes and wholly sincere intentions, might just be enough. You leave the lounge with a small sigh, the scent of toasted dust and oversteeped tea clinging gently to your clothes. The corridor welcomes you back, and once more, the hush feels deeper than silence. It feels intentional. There's a door you haven't noticed before, tucked behind a hanging tapestry that looks suspiciously like someone tried to embroider a map of a haunted abbey using only 4 colors and a great deal of ambition. Behind the door is a staircase, spiral and slim, winding downward. You follow it. The stone is cool beneath your fingertips, and the air changes, less musty, more mineral, as if the ground itself is storing secrets. You descend slowly, careful not to slip. The bottom opens into a low-ceilinged chamber, circular and lined wall-to-wall with filing drawers, every handle precisely labeled. Here lies the deep archive. This is where the oddest, most unruly, and often most unshelvable ghost reports were stored, an unofficial annex to the neatness upstairs. You get the sense that this place wasn't supposed to exist, but no one had the heart to destroy it. So it was quietly maintained, dusted occasionally, and spoken of in tones usually reserved for cellar wine or particularly sensitive in-laws. You open a drawer labeled Hiccuping Apparitions, 1860 to 1872. Inside, a slim folder of handwritten testimonies describing a specter who haunted a schoolhouse and disrupted exams with sporadic, wet-sounding gulps. The headmistress, according to one report, left out a glass of water and a note, "Do try to breathe between syllables." Historians still argue whether this collection served a genuine archival purpose or if it was a form of therapy for the librarians, a space where the unexplainable could be acknowledged without being solved. Another drawer, Apparitions that Smell Like Biscuits. Subcategories include almond, burned oat, and unknown savory. All neatly documented, even if none made it into official indexes. You leaf through another folder titled Mutually Agreed Hauntings, detailing cases where the living and the spectral reached informal arrangements. One room for the ghost, quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., occasional flickering allowed so long as tea wasn't being poured. One homeowner even knitted a small cushion for her resident spirit, who apparently disliked standing. A note pinned inside, "These hauntings often lasted longest." Next to the files is a rotating carousel rack marked Unverified Whisperings. Each slot holds a wax cylinder, lovingly labeled with the scrawl of Victorian stenographers. Drawing Room 4B, Suspected Footsteps, April 1892. Library East Wing, repeated use of the word alas. Unknown location, possible phantom reciting the periodic table, incomplete. There's a small phonograph on a stand, polished but ancient. You play one at random. The crackle is intense at first, but then you hear it, a soft, rhythmic creak, like a rocking chair on floorboards. Faint humming follows. Not threatening. Just persistent. You replace the cylinder and scan the shelf labeled Experiments. Here, the Victorian librarians went a step beyond documentation. They tested. One file contains notes from an experiment in spectral acclimatization, essentially, leaving friendly notes and floral arrangements in haunted rooms to reduce ghostly aggression. It had mixed results. The ghost of Miss Abernathy, for instance, shredded every daffodil but left the poems untouched. Another log recounts controlled summonings via bad Latin, performed by a clerk named Winthrop who'd once been expelled from seminary. He never summoned anything, but his pronunciation offended at least one monk and possibly one demon. A third folder lists attempts to classify ghosts by mood. The categories: moody, broody, bashful, chatty, and dramatic. One entity was marked as moody with chaotic aspirations. You pause at a shelf marked discarded classifications. Apparently, librarians had once tried cataloging spirits by shoe size, frequency of size, and their reaction to romantic poetry. None proved consistent. A display case nearby houses items left by ghosts, a curious if questionably authenticated exhibit, a button believed to have fallen off a spectral waistcoat, a quill dipped in ink with no author, a single dance card filled out in ghostly script, and a pocket watch that always runs 15 minutes behind the moment someone feels they are being watched. There's something deeply soothing about how earnestly it's all presented. Not debunked. Not sensationalized. Just noticed. Marked. Preserved. And maybe that's the point. Victorian librarians didn't need their ghosts to prove themselves. They only needed them to show up. You take a seat on a nearby bench, clearly placed for reflection. A brass plaque above reads, "Do not fear the silence. It may be listening back." In this dim, deliberate room, time doesn't feel linear. You think of the librarians who filled these drawers, their careful penmanship, their inside jokes and outside-the-box empathy. You think of the ghosts, not as wailing threats, but as archived curiosities, almost grateful to be filed. One file in your lap reads simply, "Sleep talkers who whisper to shadows." It's mostly quotes. "I told him the ink was dry, but he kept writing." "There's a lady in the curtain, but she says she's only borrowing it." "Please don't wake me, I'm hosting guests from another era." You close the folder gently and return it to its drawer. The air is thicker now, not oppressive, just full of memory, of paper and purpose. You take one more walk around the circular room. Your footsteps are the only sound, the kind that even a ghost might pause to hear. And somewhere in the folds of your thoughts, there's a quiet realization: the Victorians weren't trying to trap the supernatural. They were trying to coexist with it. To give it a proper shelf, a form, a name. Because sometimes, naming the strange is enough to make it feel less alone. Back up the spiral staircase you go, your hand trailing the wall as if to leave a small whisper of yourself behind. The rest of the library is still hushed, still glowing faintly with its own inner light. Outside, morning has arrived, not with fanfare, but with that soft, diffuse brightness that seeps into old windows and outlines dust motes like tiny, floating thoughts. You find yourself once more at the front desk, now unstaffed. A little bell sits beside a half-written sign, "Gone to chase the overdue ghosts. Back shortly." Charming! Possibly literal. You drift down the central aisle, past reference books whose titles still echo faintly: Apparitions of the Northern Railways, Lesser-Known Whales of the West Country, The Ethical Spectre, a handbook. Each volume snug in its place, each one an offering to the long, strange conversation between the living and whatever lingers beyond bedtime. Past the card catalog now, with its soft wooden clicks, and past the listening booth with its velvet curtains slightly ajar. You resist the urge to step inside again, though something tells you a familiar whisper might be waiting, something that sounds just like your name being said by someone who's read your diary. Instead, you head toward the conservatory, a room you haven't entered until now. It smells faintly of dried lavender and forgotten rain. The windows are tall and streaked with condensation. A few well-kept plants doze in their clay pots. In the middle of the room is a round table, scattered with journals, teacups, and what looks like a half-knitted scarf. This was the break room, you realize. The place where the librarians came to sit, to think, to wonder if they were doing anything at all that mattered. There's a chalkboard on the far wall titled Ghost of the Week. Underneath, someone has scrawled Barnaby, friendly, faintly floral, tends to rearrange footnotes. A note beneath it says, "Leave him ginger biscuits. He's picky." Historians still argue whether this entire collection, the Ghost Archive, the whispered recordings, the eccentrically filed folders, was a legitimate attempt at documenting the paranormal, or simply a decades-long act of collective theater. A beautiful illusion, designed to give form to what the Victorians feared most, the unknown. But maybe, just maybe, it was both. After all, what is history if not a story we choose to believe? And what is a haunting if not a memory with ambition? You pour yourself a lukewarm cup of tea from a small tin pot. It tastes slightly of chamomile and paper. You don't mind. It fits the mood. You take a final slow walk around the room, letting your fingers brush the backs of chairs, the corners of desks, the rim of a peculiar bell jar holding what appears to be a feather labeled possibly ghost goose. Why not? You pass a final bulletin board near the exit. It's crowded with pinned notes, messages from librarians to each other and, it seems, to their ghosts. Try not to hum during cataloging hours. Barnaby, we appreciate the effort, but please stop annotating the margins. If you must manifest, please use the staff kitchen and not the cloakroom. And one last card, written in looping ink, remember, this place isn't here to prove. It's here to notice. You pause at the door. The outside world feels louder before you even step into it. You imagine the clatter of carts, the steam of early bakery windows, the street sweepers starting their morning shifts. It's not unwelcome, just different. Harder. Faster. But the echo of the archive hums within you still. And maybe, when the city grows too sharp again, when sleep feels like a myth whispered by someone else's pillow, you'll find your way back here. Back to the card catalog of sighs. The hallway of soft footfalls. The spectral suggestion of ginger biscuits. You pull your coat tighter and step into the morning. And just for a moment, as your shadow stretches ahead of you, you think you see another shadow beside it. Faint. Polite. Possibly floral. It does not follow. But you suspect it's watching. Not haunting. Just noticing. And really, isn't that the kindest kind of ghost? Let the final images of this night linger a little longer, soft candlelight spilling across a desk, paper rustling like distant footsteps, the comforting creak of wooden floorboards beneath slippered feet. Imagine the hush of the archive settling over your shoulders like a warm shawl, woven with quiet laughter, unread footnotes, and the faint scent of lavender biscuits. Breathe slowly now. Let the air around you feel a little thicker, a little slower, as if the world has agreed to pause while you float gently between memory and rest. You've walked through corridors of curiosity, stepped gently around the edges of uncertainty, and found yourself in the kind of story that doesn't need a tidy ending, just a soft one. Whatever ghosts followed you here tonight are nothing to fear. They are the kind that alphabetize their rattles and hum lullabies into keyholes. They don't want to scare you, they want to be shelved beside your dreams, neatly labeled, properly footnoted, and perhaps even hugged, just a little. Let your thoughts drift now, unhurried and untethered. You're not alone in your wondering. Somewhere, a librarian adjusts their spectacles and makes room for your story on the shelf. And as you exhale one last time into the quiet, remember this. Sleep doesn't always need to be earned. Sometimes it just needs to be invited.